Schuettpelz. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first session of Saturday and day 2 of IndigiPalooza MT. On behalf of the Missoula Public Library, Celia Avila, who is introducing Mariah Gladstone downstairs, and myself, we welcome you. My name is Anna East, and I'm the Executive Director of Chickadee Community Services, which is the fiscal agent for this event. And as the fiscal agent, I have the distinct pleasure of being able to look at and come into contact with every single donation that we receive. And these are donations from hundreds of individual people, from $3 all the way up to several $1,000s. So I just want to express my boundless gratitude for all the folks who gave and people who didn't give for coming and just being a supportive presence with what we're doing here. I do need to thank our tobacco level sponsors, $5,000 and up. That is the Montana Historical Society, Sandra Rowe, the Henry Family Foundation, the Missoula Public Library Foundation, and the Potlatch Fund. So we are going to go ahead and get started. Our session today is telling our stories ourselves, and I'm going to hand it off to our moderator, Montana's Poet Laureate, Chris Latray.
Bonjour, Boomatong, Hininuwe Maganadug. Hello and good morning to all of my relatives. I'm glad you guys are here. You're going to get tired of me because I'm moderating everything today. We talked about trying to find more people, and I said, let's just not worry about that, and I'll just handle it. Because I handpicked pretty much everybody that is here this week because they're all interesting people, and many of them are my friends. And the goal here is not so much for us to talk at you, though if we get on a roll, we're totally going to do that. But as I spoke last night about the intertribal nature of this whole event, intertribal between the tribal members that we've brought here as presenters and speakers and all of that, but the intertribal nature of what we're doing here as a community and everybody who lives here. This corridor was an indigenous superhighway for hundreds and hundreds of years of people going back and forth from east to west. Folks living west of here coming out over the mountains east through this canyon to hunt buffalo and trade. And people talk about this being Salish land, which is why we put the Flathead Nation flag up to identify it. So everybody's very clear on whose place we're in, as long as there wasn't like a camp of Blackfeet on the other side of the river. So, you know, it's that intertribal flexibility of how we interacted as people for a long, long, long time. And today we're beginning with storytellers that, you know, in kind of the modern era that we might consider when people think of storytelling, they think of writing. But the goal of this festival is to make it clear that storytelling exists in many, many artistic expressions. There are storytellers out here with vendors, and I hope you spend freely and vigorously out amongst them between panel discussions. We chose not to have merch related to the festival just to make everybody, well, what am I going to do with these $300? Well, have at it. So what we have here are my friends Diane Wilson, and I'll let you each introduce yourself when the time comes if you feel like it. James Vukelich, Kaagegaabaw, and Carrie Schuettpelz. Did I get that right? I was going to ask you, I thought I was right, Carrie Lowry Schuettpelz. So writers of multiple genres, each of them, you know. So James is here. He's a great public speaker, which is storytelling, as well as his 7 Generations and 7 Grandfathers book, as well as a children's book. And Diane has written a number of nonfiction works related to her Dakota heritage, as well as one of my favorite all-time novels, The Seedkeeper, which is a multi-generational story of overlap with my own people's story, the Pembina Chippewa and the relationship to the Dakota War of 1862 and how that reverberated through my history, which is then again an intertribal, because what happened in Minnesota in 1862 still reverberates. You know, when I was out in Minneapolis, and maybe you can tell me if this is true or not, but somebody told me that technically it's still illegal for more than 2 Indians to gather in one spot.
Yes.
Yes. So that's one of those things. Well, we just keep it on the books for our kind of cultural heritage of our own. It's like, that kind of sucks for many of us. So I'm just going to start with some questions. And I would love for, if I ask Carrie a question, if it inspires one of you to comment on it, we just want to keep this kind of a free-for-all. We don't have a talking stick. So we'll just be courteous. And then the goal being we have until 10:45, I believe it is. And if we can get it down to at least half an hour, if any of you have questions, we will happily take them. Is that good for everybody? Carrie, I want to start with what we talked about with your new book, because I know it's front in your mind. And what is the story that you were telling with that, and what is essential about it?
Sure. And when you say new book, it's 20 pages long so far. So it's
that's a book.
A work in progress. I love talking about my new book that's 20 pages long. Yeah, so I am writing a book called Trust, How Native Land Was Stolen and How We Get It Back. It's nonfiction. I come from a policy background, and so I consider myself a policy practitioner and teacher of policy. And I'm also, Diane and I were talking about this earlier, I'm a very tangible person. I have a hard time thinking abstractly. And I fear that the land back movement feels a little abstract. And so, you know, one of the things I wanted to explore was not just what are the problems associated with native land policy in this country, problems set up by the federal government, but also what are tribes doing to combat those problems and effectively get land back in big ways. And so it's been wonderful to talk to different folks across the country about, you know, we really wish that the government would change this one rule. And if they change that, man, the doors would bust right open. That's awesome, and that's sort of what I'm hoping to shine a light on. But also, you know, I was just in Montana 2 weeks ago. I'm sort of a frequent flyer to Montana now. I live in Iowa, but I was here 2 weeks ago speaking with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes about the gigantic water settlement that was signed a few years ago. And then I had a chance to go to the bison range with my family that now the tribe manages. And I just think that there's something really beautiful about those examples of getting these, again, large swaths of land back into sort of the stewardship of the people who it belongs to.
From tangible, I love that we placed you in front of the land back. It's like let's get the spirit world.
I didn't do that on purpose.
The spirit world said, "Put Carrie here," and we listened, which is a perfect segue, James, to a question for you. So we have tangible policy. You kind of write and exist in a different world. So we've got your 7 generations and your 7 grandfathers book, with your children's wonderful children's book, Wisdom Weavers. Which what I love is that it's got QR codes that when you scan them, they teach you the language. So this is like multimedia without having to pick up a stupid phone and be distracted by hellish updates from the AP or something like that. But for us, it is tangible. The spirit world, the connection through multi-generations with our ancestors, and that's so much where you live in your work. How do we? Number one, do you have anything to say about that? And number two, how do we layer that? Because I think there's a relationship between the idea of land back and what does that look like? What does land back even mean from an actual physical transfer of control of land versus the relationship that we have with land, which is a part of that? And that is, I think, one of the challenges for us as Indigenous people is sharing that kind of, for lack of a better word, mystical relationship to the world around us versus the hard and dry. If I can't measure it and see it and count it, it doesn't exist.
I tried to reach that crossroads of both tangible and also the spiritual and I suppose in some context mystical aspect of the language in my work. I had the good fortune of, when I was learning the language, to study with both hereditary chiefs, fluent first language speakers, elders, medicine people, as well as with the world's leading linguistic expert in the language. So when I began looking at the words, some of the words that I break down or that I interpret the etymology and the morphemes in the 7 generations and the 7 grandfather teachings, my approach was, all right, I didn't grow up with the language. I had to learn the language later as an older man. I was a 25-year-old when I really first heard the language. My approach became, well, how can I use the scientific part of this to describe some of these mystical aspects of it? And so by looking at what these small word parts meant, I was able to, for me, tell a story about the history of some of these words that date back literally thousands upon thousands of years. And so that was a huge part of both a scientific process as well as the oral tradition, the oral concept, because it was like, how are we going to pass these teachings down, the same teaching, generation after generation, millennia after millennia? We'll put it in the language. We'll put it in the one place that people will always be able to go to. Human beings speak because we're hardwired to, the same reason we can taste, hear, touch, or smell. And so where will we put these teachings? In the language. And when I think about land back, and I think about the language and that connection it establishes with people who are no longer here, people who, when they came up with these teachings, knew that they would never see, talk, visit, or hold us. Hundreds or maybe even thousands of years later, it gives me a perspective of how they related to the land. Through ceremony, through everyday life, through relationship. And so when we do talk about something like land back, we have this blueprint that was laid out for us. This is how it's worked for thousands of years. If you return to this, it will work. One of my concerns is that if we return to the land back, for lack of a better term, without Anji without transforming our lives, I think a crude translation into English would be decolonized. We would maybe act the same way as the people who have come here. We would forget that relationship that we had with the land. And I think that the language and the stories in those words show us, they tell us, they walk us through it, how we can relate. Be great.
Yeah, thank you. So, in relationship to that, the Dakota War of 1862 was an uprising because the Dakota people were being starved, essentially. They'd signed these treaties to be in relationship with the federal government, and the federal government wasn't holding up their end of the bargain. So there was a particular trader who was withholding these foods, and the Dakota are starving. So they rose up in the summer of 1862. For me, one of the greatest stories of the Dakota people is them finding that the quote that the trader was quoted as saying is, "We'll let them eat grass." And when they found him later, his mutilated body, his mouth was stuffed full of grass. To me, that's just like a powerful story right there. And you can go to the place, it's right by the airport, like where the people were gathered up and held in a prison camp, essentially, before they were returned and told never to come back to Minnesota, right? And you live there. And your book, if I recall, opens with those people being scattered. The Seed Keeper, which if you haven't read it, it's beautiful. And there's a shared relationship to like what James was talking about with the story that you're telling. Can you expand on that a little better than I can? Because it lives across time.
Hamatakiapi, Diane Wilson amakiapia, bide wakantwano yate hamatahaya, sichangu oyate edomawapia. So hello all my relatives, my name's Diane Wilson. I am enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation. I'm a descendant of the Bide Wakantwano Yate, the Dakota people in Minnesota. And these are the people who were removed after the war that we're talking about here, the 1862 Dakota War. And this is something that I didn't learn in school growing up, and a lot of people in Minnesota didn't learn. And so I got involved with the Dakota Commemorative March in 2002, and that was several people, academics, who decided that it was time for us to honor and remember the Dakota who were forcibly removed from the state. And first they were marched down to that concentration camp down at Badote, which is both our place of origin and it's also our place of from which we were exiled. And so that place is very important to Dakota people. And so the march then was a way to honor those ancestors. And that it was on that march that I first heard a story that became the heart of the novel. And it was about Dakota women who didn't know where they were going to be sent or why or how they were going to feed their families. And so they hid their seeds in the hems of their skirts and in their pockets. And then when they were put on flatboats and shipped down to St. Louis and then up to the Crow Creek Reservation, they had those seeds with them, and those seeds helped them survive. And in the same way, they helped those seeds survive. So the seeds themselves actually made their way back to Minnesota, as well as Dakota people. It's still illegal for Dakota people to be in Minnesota. That law has remained on the books. But when I heard that story, it was something that just took hold of my heart. And so when I started working with a little organization called Dream of Wild Health, which is a native farm that is focused on preserving and growing out those seeds, like the ones, the corn that was removed from the state with the women, then they grow that corn out and they return it back to the community. And so when I got involved with that organization, that's where I started to learn about our relationship with food, our relationship with seeds, with land, and that the way that we take care of it is by being in a relationship of reciprocity. So that the land and the seeds take care of us by giving us food and water, and in turn we take care of our water and our land and our seeds. And so there is this beautiful, caring, loving, reciprocal relationship that to me is at the heart of our Indigenous relationship with land and water. And so that is what became the focus for the book. That is the work that I was privileged to do in community for many years. And when I was thinking about a book, it became my way to give back. Like these are the teachings, similar teachings to what James and Carrie are both talking about, and these are the. This is what I wanted to convey in the book. I wanted to make sure that we preserved this knowledge that the elders had shared with us. We preserved the knowledge that the seeds had shared with us, and that we carry it forward for future generations. So this book is my love letter back to the seeds themselves.
Thank you for that. So, and for those who don't know, this episode ends, well, not really ends, but kind of culminates in the single largest execution in United States history. So it's December 26th, 1862, where 38 Dakota are hanged, and there's a monument to that in Mankato, Minnesota, which is actually a pretty nice little monument. I visited a couple times. But that story, when I talk about the overlap, me and I think like 3/5 of our entourage of Little Shell people who went out in 2022 to participate in the commemoration of the Treaty of Old Crossing, which was supposed to happen in 1862, but ended up happening in 1863 because of the uprising. And at the time, there's still a bounty on native ears, native scalps, by the Minnesota government. And, you know, it was supposed to be just Dakota, but no one was keeping track. So, you know, imagine showing up and there's a Gatling gun on the hill and you know that your scalp is worth however much. It was a pretty exorbitant amount. I have a number, but it's probably wrong, and I don't like to Okay, it was $200.
It was
$2,000. What was it, 200, right? Yeah. Yeah, per scalp. And do you think they're saying, oh, this is Dakota, I can't take that one, when we've got all of our Michif and Chippewa people who've been sharing this land for thousands of years? It's just it's a story that just keeps happening. And I'm curious, Diane, just to stay with you, you're working on a memoir right now. And did you have a memoir or when you were working on The Seed Keeper in mind, or is there anything related to what you learned working on this book that you wanted to kind of center somehow in your relationship to being Dakota and how this history lives in you as well?
Such good questions, Chris.
I'm just winging it.
Wow. You must have had your coffee this morning. Yes. In fact, I think of each of my books as building on what I've written so far, so that my first book was about cultural identity and my mother's family and how it changed over generations. And then wondering, well, then what do we do about this history that is so filled with trauma and loss? And the second book dealt with historical trauma by interviewing elders. And then the third book was The Seed Keeper, and that's a way of looking at food sovereignty as a return to, as a way to respond to historical trauma. And food sovereignty, for me, that work is so joyful, and it's a way of addressing in your body a return to health and a return to a relationship with land. So in the new memoir, I'm looking specifically at my own relationship with land. And I live on 10 acres in Minnesota with a tamarack bog. And so the fields that surround the bog have a lot of, it was overgrazed. So there have been a lot of over-enthusiastic plants that have been allowed, and under my watch, I admit it, to just expand and take over. They have colonized the land. And so I'm looking at this land now as being a Dakota person on what is Dakota homeland, and not having the skills that my ancestors would have had to know how to use the medicines, to know how to take care of that land, to know how to manage it in ways that would have kept the balance. So the memoir for me is, this is what Carrie and I were talking about earlier today. We have a lot of beautiful books that deal with abstract concepts like decolonize the land. But what I want to know is, well, what does that look like in the morning? You know, what tool do I need to go out and decolonize my land? And for me, that tool is the lopper. So I love my lopper. And I'm removing acres of prickly ash and buckthorn right now. And so, and I don't have I'm not an expert, I'm not a botanist, I'm not, I'm just someone who really wants to see the land in better shape. So I'm learning as I go how to be a Dakota person back on a Dakota homeland.
I think that's common for Native people. It's certainly common for me, reconnecting with who I am as an Anishinaabe person, as a Métis person, whatever label I want to wear that day, but not living in a community where you're surrounded by your language and your culture and all of those things, and how that plays out in the lateral violence that we inflict on each other as Native people. And I came to the realization, as I was reconnecting that, and then the place I was doing, is that it was the land that was calling me back. Like, our original teachers are still out there. And when we say our culture or our language has died, it hasn't. It's still there. It's up to us to return to it. And for lack of a community where I can sit with elders, I can sit in the midst of old growth ponderosas at Hellgate, or at Council Grove, where the Hellgate Treaty was signed, and they were there. They witnessed all of those things. And I just feel like if I spend enough time out there, I'm going to learn something that I may not realize in the moment. But I want to ask you, Carrie, since you guys were talking about what does it look like to you? What is your tool in the morning to actually manifest some of these abstract ideas? Yeah, sorry, but I saw the look on your face.
What's my tool in the morning to manifest?
Yeah, what does decolonization look like?
Oh, boy.
One of those things.
Thanks for the softball.
You're welcome.
And I didn't really introduce myself before, but my name is Carrie Schuettpelz. I'm an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe. I currently live in Iowa, and so, I think that I ask a lot of questions. That's sort of the place I'm at. And maybe I won't be at that place forever, but I sort of relate, Diane, to what you're saying. I didn't learn a lot of this in school. And I grew up 1,000 miles away from my community. I grew up in Iowa. And so I didn't have the benefit of being surrounded by that knowledge either. And so a lot of it has been sort of self-guided study and research and asking questions. And so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to ask questions that lead me to some sort of epiphany about what we can do with it, right? So as a policy practitioner, I think a lot about what's working and what's not working. And, I've taken a lot of inspiration from other Native scholars and practitioners. There's this great quote. There's a guy out, Robert Wilson is his name, and he's a Native attorney and law professor out at Arizona State. And he has this book called Reservation Capitalism, and I really appreciated the tangibility of that book. I'm kind of an economic development nerd, and he has this great quote that's something along the lines of, if we want people to live in community and on a reservation and return to that place, we have to make it a place where they want to live. And there's just something that's really inspiring about the work that I see being done across the Native policy landscape of how do we develop economically or otherwise? How do we think about conservation within the boundaries of what can happen on the existing land and then potentially land that is returned? How do we think about return? How do we think about grand scale land return, whether it be land that the federal government owns currently or not? There was this article that came out that David Schreier, who is a Minnesotan, he wrote an article for The Atlantic, I think is where it was published, but it was called Give the National Parks Back to the Tribes. And I think that there are a lot of grand ideas that people have thrown out, and what I take comfort in a weird way, is figuring out the logistics of it, right? So, okay, give the national parks back to the tribes, but what does that look like? And what do the steps need to be to achieve that particular goal?
You know what my idea, at least as our first step for that is?
What's that?
And I said this a few years ago, and then just recently driving out to New York and back and through Chicago on the way out and the way back, I thought, if these people can put toll booths like every 50 feet for 50 miles, we can put toll booths on every access to Glacier Park through Blackfeet and CSKT land, and so that some of those millions and millions and millions of dollars in RVs and trailers stay there instead of just passing through. I mean, that's kind of flippant.
Well, here's the thing, though. So, sorry, you've hit me right
This
at
is where
the
things
point.
get,
yeah. This is what my students experience every day. So here's the thing, is that the national parks actually operate at a deficit. They make millions of dollars, but they cost more to run. And so the thought that we're just gonna give this thing back to the tribes to operate exactly as it operates today is risking putting the tribes in an economic deficit, right? And so you have to think about all of those little policy logistics before you just go and do something. And I think it would be great to return the national parks to the tribes, but it has to come with some sort of notion of what does that process look like, and how do we make it so that we're not putting them in a really, really bad economic position.
I just want $5 out of every car that drives through there. The parks can sink or swim. We just want some of that. So, I'm sorry. This is Carrie's first book, The Indian Card, which when I saw that when it came out not too close to mine. I thought, oh shit, it's probably better than mine because it's similar in your reconnection. And there's one scene in here where you're at a parade and talking about it being hot and humid. And I had just been to the parade at Crow Fair on the Crow Reservation and could just like visualize your experience here based on the one that I had just had, which is, that's what we do with literature, is we create scenes that can somehow connect to experiences that we've had as readers. What's the connection from, like this is not just your reconnection, but also, who gets to be Native in America, so blood quantum. And you touch on a number of those kind of key Indigenous kind of talking points, I guess. You know what I mean?
That's a policy word.
Yeah, just this.
Yeah.
It's like oozing off you, and I'm starting to catch it.
I'm sorry. I'm really sorry about that. So I have this card in my wallet. I don't know, maybe other people have it too, that says that I'm an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe. And I have spent a lot of time just flipping it around in my hands saying, like, where the hell did this come from? Like, my ancestors 200 years ago certainly did not have a card in their wallet, right? And so that was the basic inquiry that launched this project. And as a data and policy nerd, I couldn't help myself. So I created this database of every federally recognized tribe in the lower 48 and how they determine membership. I was just curious. I'm curious, do they use blood quantum? Do they not? What is it they're basing it off of in terms of like connecting yourself to a person? Is it a constitution or a role from the 1800s? Is it more recent? I was just curious. And so I put together this database, and from that just sort of ruminated on that, but also walked through the historical moments that happened that led us to a point where the federal government quantifies us by blood, right? I mean, it was interesting to me to think about the history of counting people. Where did that come from? What are the reasons? But also, as part of the project, I spoke with Native women all across the country about their relationship to identity and enrollment. And it was a really comforting moment to realize that I think a lot of us are walking around thinking, am I Native enough? Like, what's the point at which I am Native enough? What's the threshold? And so I talked to women who had been adopted out of their tribes. I talked to women who couldn't enroll because their dad wasn't a member of that tribe. I talked to women whose children won't have enough blood quantum. I mean, just on and on and on. And so the more that I talked to people, the more I sort of realized that these are conversations that have been had before, but I think are really powerful and important as we think about the future of Native enrollment in particular.
Wonderful. So James, we were talking last night about, what you're working on next. And I think perhaps differently from the other panelists here is, your written work rises from your speaking work. And I've seen James give a similar presentation 3 or 4 times. And every time I'm moved by something different. And it's like when you go back and rewatch a movie or reread some poetry or read a book again, it's that kind of thing where there are little bits and pieces. And is that something that just happened? I kind of know your story, but I just would like you to talk about it, because that's as traditional as it gets, is walking out in front of a room or sitting down around a fire with people and we tell stories. And you do it masterfully. And at what point did you decide, well, there's a book here, or is that just another way to reach the people I'm trying to reach? How do you envision that for yourself?
I'm so glad you mentioned that because I was a reluctant author. I'll explain that. After grad school, I left grad school, I was done with writing. Writing had been something joyful in undergrad. It had been creative. And then it turned into labor. It had constant scrutiny. Everything had to be publishable quality. And I'm like, I'm done with the work. Like, I still loved the language, though. And I was like, well, I really want to lean into literally 10,000 years of oral tradition. It's in my blood, it's in my genes, and I loved hearing elders speak. I loved hearing them tell stories, to give lectures, to talk about the words, and I thought, well, how could I possibly do that? We live in a different time than those people did. The elders who I learned from, some who had literally, one had been born in a lodge, in like a Waginogan, a birch bark lodge. And with the advent, paradoxically, of social media, I had a chance where I could speak about so many of these words I had learned and had loved and wanted to talk with about people, but I didn't have to write it out. Didn't have to grammar check, I didn't have to spell check or run it by an editor. So I began literally filming myself doing these short vignettes that I would post on both Facebook and then later TikTok and Instagram. And it was a way to, again, to communicate some of these words that I loved so much, to lean into the oral tradition aspect of it and kind of get away from the written part of it. So I'd done this for several years and I'm like, all right, I figured it out. I don't have to do this. And then I don't have to write. Even emails are dreadful for me. I go over them, I'm grammar checking them. I'm like, oh, is it? I'm so sick and tired of that. It's getting better. It's getting better. And then in 2020, for example, if you're wondering how I finally wrote this book, I said I would do it for like 3 years and didn't touch it at all. And then my father became ill. He became terminally ill in 2020. And during a discussion, he knew I had that character where I'd been talking about it and didn't do it. He made me promise that I would write the book, write the 7 generations and 7 grandfather teachings. The talk you've heard so many times. Now, when I do the talk, it's a lot like a jazz performance. Every time it has, you can improvise, you can work with it. There will be moments you want to focus in if you're feeling that, if you're hopefully vibing with the audience. There's a reciprocal part of the Ojibwe language. It's a suffix, it's an infix rather. De, it means where they do it with one another. So in the talk, it's not just me talking to the audience, we're learning with one another. And in this case, I was like, well, how can I maybe reach more people that will not see these talks on Facebook, who will not be in a public performance or discourse? And it would be through the book. So after my dad passed away, everything started coming together. I was able to do transcriptions of the talk rather than writing it out to kind of keep with the oral tradition aspect. I like to think of it in linguistics, we called it an oral text. So it wasn't something that you had written, it had been something that had been spoken about. So that's what I really wanted to focus on. And for the next works that I'm working on, it's transcribing some of those talks that I've done on both Facebook and Instagram and, getting those documented. So they have an opportunity to reach even more people, which I've loved. My goal was just to be able to speak about the 7 generations and 7 grandfather teachings all over the world. It transformed my life. For me to hopefully share some of the joy and the transformative aspects with it, with whomever, was one of the overarching goals. So yeah, really trying to lean into the oral aspect of it, the spoken aspect, and that's really what's been pushing me forward for the past couple of years. May take a moment. They introduce themselves. We always do this in Anishinaabe and Ojibwe. Buju and Dinwe Maganatuk. Anin. Hello, all of my relatives. Kaagegaabaw Indigenous cause. My name is Kaagegaabaw. It's he who stands eternally. Mekanak and Dudem. I'm Turtle Clan. Mekanak Wajuing and Dunjaba. I'm a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. And Miigwech Bizendawi. Thanks for listening.
Listening to you, it occurs to me, like teaching in Indigenous cultures, like if you receive a teaching, it's your obligation to share that teaching. You don't hoard it for yourself. You don't gatekeep who gets to hear it. And we're going to be talking about that later in another panel this afternoon. But I was thinking about what you say, and even like Buju and Dinwe Maganadug, I learned that from you. And every time I say it, I don't say, well, according to James Vukelich, what I'm about to say means this. In the way that if we try and grab a quote from somebody or a poem that we want to put in the front of our book, all of the legal wrangling we have to do to make it okay in a written text, we don't have to do it in the oral tradition. That doesn't mean we value it any less. Every time that I learn something from James, and I do it all the time, is look up an idea or go back to an idea that you've already shared. I'm not the only one doing that. You know, you've reached many, many people, thousands and thousands, if not millions of people through the work you do. And that's how we preserve these things. We don't have to get rights. We don't have to go through the path of email this person who doesn't respond. It's a pain in the butt to do it legally for text. I don't want to steal anything from anybody. I want to share stuff, which kind of brings me to the last question I would like to ask, because you've mentioned elders a lot. And before we go to questions to the audience, so start queuing them up in your brain. I was just very fortunate to be able to take my beautiful mother out to breakfast earlier this week for her 80th birthday. And at 80, I still wouldn't mess with her, even though I like outweigh her by 3 times or whatever. But I think about that in the fact that my parents' generation, you might want to plug your ears, Mom, is like the older end of our current elders, you know, 80s, you know, mid-70s into the 90s. So then that means my generation is next up. We're on deck. And that kind of freaks me out because I don't feel like I know shit yet. And do you think about that, James? You know, I mean, you're a little younger than me, but like we're up next. Carrie, don't be laughing. You're not that far behind. Do you think about that?
A lot.
Yeah.
All the time. In fact, one of the reasons I didn't want to do talks was because the elders I learned from were so good. And I'm like, if you had to hear me, you would be getting ripped off. Like, it's nothing in comparison. But there is that point where we begin assuming responsibility for, all right, what are we passing down to the generations that are coming? In my book, The 7 Generations and 7 Grandfather Teachings, we have this word in Anishinaabe. It's Indanakobichigan. Indanakobichigan. Now, if you look it up in the dictionary, it has 3 different translations. One is to a great-grandparent, another is an ancestor, and the other is my great-grandchild. So when you look at that word, it implies 7 generations, from great-grandparent to myself to my great-grandchildren. So we're interconnected, we're interlinked. And in those links in the chain, people will, you know, it's implied, people will pass on, people will go home, they'll return back to the spirit world. But then you find yourself that, oh, who's going to pass on these teachings next? And as the years go on and those beloved and delightful teachers who have shared so much with you begin returning home, it becomes an exhilarating responsibility, kind of intimidating as well. So it has been in my mind. As a language activist, it's kind of like recording those speakers now, which I know in the Anishinaabe country, they're getting really good at taking that time to show, again, affection, care, respect for those teachings that they want to pass down, and then recording those, making sure that not just my children, but literally my great-grandchildren, hopefully if it's done properly, their great-grandchildren will have that same opportunity to learn those teachings that I have. So yeah, it's
Yeah, Diane.
I have a thought, because this is such an important question, and in the work that I've done and the people I've interviewed over the years, and one of the stories that just really touched me was all the elders who had been through boarding schools or whose families had been through boarding schools and didn't grow up with the teachings, didn't grow up with the parenting that would have taught them who they should be by the time they get to be elder stage. And I think, I don't know what the answer is to that, but it always just touched my heart that these people who have so much to offer as human beings felt ashamed because they didn't maybe have their language or they didn't grow up learning what they would have learned had it not been for programs like boarding schools. And I think we're in that process of reclaiming those teachings and also learning how to adapt to new ones. Sometimes we have to, language revitalization is part of it, but I think it's really important that we honor our elders regardless for what they know and who they are and what they've been through and what they've experienced. So I'm grateful. I'm grateful to their survival, most of all.
Carrie, do you have a thought before we turn it over? It'll turn green in a second.
Here it is. Okay. Yeah, the boarding school thing in particular, I've talked to a lot of boarding school survivors, and one of the things that I hear most often is exactly that, this idea, and it's not just that they have not had the ability to learn from their elders in the same way as were they not to have gone to boarding school, but it's also that in a lot of cases it creates this sense of disconnection. And so it's almost like this chain was broken. And you see that sort of in the patterns of where boarding school survivors live and, you know, how connected they feel to community. I just got a grant from the Mellon Foundation, and one of the things that we're doing is a national boarding school survivor records return. And so there exist hundreds of thousands of records inside the National Archives of boarding school survivors. And these things include handwritten letters from family members, postcards, photos in some cases, medical records. I mean, anything that you can imagine about you at age 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and up, they're sitting in the National Archives, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so we're going to open a portal in late October where any boarding school survivor anywhere in the world can request their records, and we will deliver them free of charge. And so, you know, I think that it's even honoring the experience, and I think that we just haven't done a good enough job of doing that, of honoring the experience and providing whatever support we can to those elders who have gone through that experience, whether it be mental health care or like meaningful support beyond extractive things that we ask of them.
Great. All right, who's got a question? I'm sorry, Alyssa, my mom's.
And I'm sorry, this really isn't a question, this is more of an observation that you guys are talking about elders and what you're learning from the elders. But from my point of view, you guys are the elders now. And that doesn't mean age. It means there was a whole generation lost. And Chris cries really, really easy. Pretty soon you're going to see why. And where he learned, it's hereditary. But Chris knows this story himself. His grandparents were ashamed. So they lost that. They didn't tell this story. And if it weren't for Chris and listening to people like you that are sitting up on this podium and his interest, this would have been lost. So you guys are the elders now at your young age. So don't forget that. And it's only going to get better. You guys are only going to get better. So you are the teachers now. And anyway, that's what I have to say.
I don't have my wallet on me, but I'll talk to you later. Alyssa?
Miigwech.
Hi, so I do a lot of work at Yellowstone with tribal stuff, and one of the things I have to look at is like multifaceted, because we bring in prisoners that have heritage from one of the tribes that's associated with the park. Then we, a lot of that is kind of more centered on sharing with visitors. So both sides of that is being able to share directly, not being censored, but then also like, what do we want people to walk away with? So what do you want someone that's not Indigenous to walk away with? Because we're still a minority and we're not gonna be able to do this alone. And we can't fund it alone either. So what would you want someone to walk away with to like take this on and help?
From a national park.
Well, it's a perilous question, because even taking on Yellowstone, so Yellowstone recognizes 27 tribes as having somehow either lived in or hunted in or interacted with Yellowstone in some form or another. The tribes ourselves, we recognize 60. And even if you look at those 27, the Turtle Mountain Chippewa are one of them, the Little Shell Chippewa are, but Rocky Boy isn't. And we're the same. We're so closely related. We were Pembina at the time. And so a lot of that is kind of arbitrary. But if you say, well, we want input on place names, well, whose name? When you've got that many tribes, and who gets to decide? So even trying to organize as Indigenous people we've got, I have Blackfeet friends. They're still mad at Crow people because were guides for Custer. And that's flippant, but it's also kind of true. So these elements are recent in many of us. Carrie.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I say in my book is I think that often Native America is lumped into sort of one pot, and every tribe is different. And so one of the observations I made recently when I was in Montana a couple weeks ago was my family and I went to Glacier National Park, and we went to the bison range that was recently returned to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And everything was different. When I went to the bison range, one of the things that really stuck out to me was the types of things I was learning about were so rooted in the land and the history of this land. And my kids loved learning about the different animals that we were going to see and sort of their importance to the broader ecological system. That was very different than the signage we saw at Glacier. And so I don't have the answer to what do we want people to leave with. The tribes do, though. And so I think that that's one of the really important things about, eventually returning the national parks in a fiscally responsible way to the tribes. But, that's one of the things that needs to happen is some sort of notion of what do they want? What do they want visitors to come away with? What messaging do they want? But also, what do they want as it relates to how the land is stewarded?
Can I jump in
Yes,
on that?
Please.
One of the reasons I wanted to write the 7 generations and 7 grandfather teachings was if I were to meet someone, and having worked with Indian education for over 2 decades, so many people have never had the opportunity to maybe even meet Indigenous people or even have a conversation with them. And if you wanted to walk away after a brief meeting with an Anishinaabe person, what would I like to share with you about my culture? And it would be, well, what are our grandfather teachings? What are our sacred laws? And what's our perspective of the world? It's not just I'm focusing on me rather than that vast perspective of 7 generations. My ancestors' choices and decisions have the potential to affect me. And my choices right now will affect someone I'll never see, speak to, listen to, or hold. So when I was thinking about what would I like them to walk away with, I wanted to say this earlier when I listened to you speak about the seeds. And this has happened so often in intertribal Indigenous settings where I've heard someone share a teaching and then people who speak a totally unrelated language, totally unrelated culture will say, we have that teaching too. When you were speaking about looking after the seeds and the seeds look after us, I was thinking about our sacred law, our grandfather teaching of Manachi Itiwan. Now, if you look it up in the dictionary, it means to respect and to go easy on. But really what it is I am taking care of the seeds. I'm looking after them. And that dis suffix, it's reciprocal. Then the seeds are looking after me. When we looked at the buffalo, we're buffalo people. We took only what we needed, but from an Ojibwe perspective, the buffalo looked at us and said, you guys are quite pathetic. You will not survive if we do not feed you, clothe you, and give you shelter. You're not going to make it. So all of a sudden that respect, that reciprocity, it was to acknowledge kind of the sacred in our relatives' lives, in that relationship. That would be one of the things I would like to send someone away with, that, oh, that's a little different than my perspective. From an intertribal perspective, like Dakota and Ojibwe, we have a very long history. Our languages are not related at all. It would be like a German hearing Mandarin Chinese. Totally different language families, totally different, but yet these teachings will show up and there'll be a familiarity and an understanding. So that would be one perspective in having each of the tribes tell their stories, that you'll find a common a commonality in each of them.
And I would add to that thought, just briefly. In Dakota, we have a saying, "Matakuye Awasi," and it means we're all related. And that means everyone in this room, but all of us with everyone outside this room, the trees, the land, the water, the air, all of the beings. And that in that implicit within that relationship is that responsibility that we share in common. And in working in an organization that was intertribal, what I saw, and I don't say this in a way to generalize across all tribes, but the ones that I worked with, that was a very common element to our cultures, was that idea of being in relationship with the world as opposed to treating the world as a commodity. And that is a distinction I try to make with every group that I have the privilege of speaking to, because I think it's so important for where we are right now in this time and moving forward and caring for the earth. We have to continue as relatives.
Yeah. And I think kind of along, when you're asking questions of Native people, I'm sure every one of you have been asked to speak for Indians or Native Americans or whatever, like this monolith. And I think it's important when you're asking a question to ask that person their experience or their tribal relationship, because they're different. And the joke I always like to use is that if you ask 10 Indians a question, you're going to get 8 different answers, and the other 2 are going to argue why the other 9 aren't even Indians. So it's not like any of us can speak for everybody. We can just kind of speak for the perspective of the people that we've immersed ourselves into. Question over here.
Thank you. I'd like to speak about my brother-in-law, Edward DeRosier, who runs Sun Tours in Glacier National Park. And he comes to mind because of your observation about how different Glacier Park was than the Bison Range. And Edward runs Sun Tours, the Indian tour group, mainly based on the east side of the park. And he's in direct competition with the red buses, which is really what you're referring to. And Edward has this problem every morning that you speak of about being able to properly talk about the mountains and the place called Glacier Park through his Indian tour guides. They have to be able to explain and characterize the park the same way every day because they're being scrutinized by the National Park Service. So it's quite a group of professionals that he has riding these buses, driving these buses that have to get special licenses. And so I think on the land back issue, it would be so great if the east side of Glacier National Park could be returned to the Blackfeet. And I think that they could actually do a pretty darn good job of running it the same way the National Park Service does. Thank you.
I think of anybody, the Blackfeet are doing a pretty good job of beginning to assert more and more of that sovereignty. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. So just to clarify what I was talking about earlier about the economic responsibility, my perspective is I think the land should be returned back to the tribes and they should be able to do what they want with it. And so I don't think it should be the case that the national park returns it to the tribes and says, here, run it exactly as we have. Make this a national park open to anyone who can pay. If that's what the tribe wants to do, that's fine. But if they want to do something else with it, I think that has to be an option too.
Yeah. As he was talking about, so Alyssa's got me going out doing cultural tours in Yellowstone a couple days this coming week, and I'm thinking, not really going to ask any Park Service people if what I'm going to say is by the book or not. And I think it's different from park to park. So, Alyssa, you can just pretend you didn't hear that. Any other questions?
So this question is specifically for Carrie, but I think probably all 3 of you can jump in. I was really interested in your descriptions of your current book and also your upcoming book. And I was kind of interested in the research process that you went through for your current book and what you anticipate that research will look like for your upcoming book on the land back.
The process, if you were to ask my agent and editor, they would describe it as terrifying because I sort of research as I go. As I discover and learn new things, necessarily the research has to change. I remember texting my editor while I was writing the Indian card, and I said, "You'll never guess what I'm researching, the 13th century Mongolian Empire." Smiley face. And she was like, question mark, question mark, question mark, question. So I think that for me, the research comes out of the continued learning I'm having. If I would have written the Indian card today, it would be a completely different book. And I think that that's something that's been really interesting as a writer, is acknowledging that my book is a point in time. You know, it was that point in time that I wrote that. That's when that occurred. For Trust, my book that I'm working on right now, the research has been a lot of talking to people, which is kind of my favorite part. But talking to different Native nations and tribes about what are the challenges you're facing, but also what are the victories that you've had. And then, you know, kind of going back to the history of how we got here as it relates to the challenge. I mean, just to throw some like technical words out at you, you know, like how did we get to the point where reservations are really checkerboarded? How did we get to this point of fractionation where you may have 1,000 heirs that own this plot of land? How did we get here, and what are the technical changes that fix those problems?
When you say trust, I'm guessing that's alluding to the nature of trust land when it comes to native land. Am I correct on that?
It is. It's also sort of it's also this idea of who do we trust?
Yeah.
Right? Like, you know, we have these treaties, 369 treaties were ratified between the U.S. government and Native nations in the 100 years that treaties were signed. Dare I say, if that period would have continued, the U.S. federal government would have whittled it down even further, right? With each treaty, they took more land, more and more and more and more and more. But there was this idea of this trust relationship and this sort of trust doctrine where the United States was supposedly the protector of Native nations and the land, you know, the fact that they had this land. And so it's sort of alluding to that too. But I will say, because you asked a policy question, I will say that this idea of trust land is also really complicated and problematic, and the processes that Native tribes have to go through to even get land into trust is kind of mind-blowing. And so that's another sort of element of like, look, you're not going to be able to do large-scale land back without fixing some of these technical and broader policy issues that are existing.
See, what I was hoping for was like a 90-second perfect explanation of what trust land really
Oh
is.
yeah, okay, trust land is...
This is all for me now at this point. Because what happens is, like Little Shell, we just got federally restored 5-6 years ago, whatever it was. And people will say, well, when are you going to get a reservation? And I say, we're never going to have a reservation. And they kind of give me a stare. I said, we're going to get 200 acres that we have to buy first, and it's going to be trust land. And then they get even blanker stare and say, well, what's that?
Trust land is... trust land is a specific designation that the federal government makes where I would say from a pragmatic standpoint, the biggest difference is it's not subject to property tax. And so trust land exists and is, it belongs to the tribe, but it also sort of belongs to the federal government in the sense that the federal government has to approve any changes that happen on trust land. Here's an example. On the Navajo Nation, which is one of the least internet connected places in the country. They were trying to increase connectivity, and that was going to require them to cut down a bunch of trees. Now, they were going to do it in a responsible way, and they had identified the trees they wanted to cut down. But in order to cut down those trees, they had to ask the federal government for permission because they were on their trust land, and the federal government said no. So, you know, trust land has pros and cons, but I think that is indicative of what I'm talking about, which is the system doesn't work completely. It is not a perfect system.
Well, and we haven't identified, I think we're in the process now of what our trust land is going to be, but I felt like our tribal chairman was very crafty in saying, okay, we want to do this thing, and the city of Great Falls would say, well, no, we don't want you to do that. And he'd say, well, I guess we'll just turn that into trust land then. And no, we can work this out, because as soon as it becomes trust land, then they don't get taxes for it. So it's this constant like game of, I almost said badminton, but it's more like dodgeball, you know? Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Carrie, you mentioned putting together a database for all the tribes with the criteria of what makes you, you know, whether it's blood quantum or, is that available to the public?
To hold up the... It is available to the public in this book.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes.
I'm so glad I'm here, and thank you all for sharing your knowledge and your skills, and the questions have been amazing. I have a question about that lost generation that Chris's mom was talking about, and the impact, as you're talking about the 7 generations, that lost generation in the middle also has ripple effects going forward. And one of the things that I think would be interesting to discuss, and I can talk afterwards, I'm actually a social scientist, so we can talk about ethnography research afterwards offline, but there is also ripples of healing that happen. So I don't want to just trace the trauma, I want to trace the healing that's happening. Thank you.
I have one comment I want to make about that, and it's related to a conference that I was at that was just a couple years ago about the boarding school, and that we're not to the point of healing yet. You know, we're only to the point of beginning to talk about it. So for the most part, as a community, we haven't reached that point where it feels like a lot of healing is happening, because so many of the wounds are only being recognized for the first time. And I can say that about my family. But James, you have a beautiful way of talking about how when we heal ourselves, we heal the people not who are to come, but the people who have already suffered. Can you speak to that?
Delighted. I was glad to hear you talk about Mitakuiapi. My Dakota's poor at best. You'll have to excuse me. Gedinawendaman, we're all related. And in that concept of Anako Bichigan, great-grandparent, ancestor, and great-grandchild, there's this morpheme in there called Anik. And it means to be interconnected, to be interlinked, to work in a sequence. So what I like to point out to people is that, you know, we didn't just inherit trauma. That I've had an opportunity to share words already in my book and this morning with you that are thousands of years old, despite a systematic effort to destroy the language, culture, history, and spirituality through policy, particularly through the boarding school and residential school era, that I'm able to share that. It shows me we've also inherited strength, courage, fortitude, resilience. That's what I would love to pass down to the generations that are coming. And I noted in that word that if I'm inextricably interconnected to my relatives, both past, present, and future, if I radically make a decision to heal myself, the only person who can make that decision for me is myself. I'm the only person who can change myself. I can't really change anyone else, but I can make that decision to change myself. And I'm still interconnected to my great-grandparents, to my grandparents, to my parents, some who are no longer here. If I heal myself, am I actually healing them? Those people who went through the worst that colonization has to offer. Those who didn't deal with it probably in a very healthy way, in a very self-caring, self-loving way. If I change myself because I'm still living their story, I'm still telling their story. If I radically change myself, have I healed them? Have I changed them? And so that becomes my approach with being interconnected, with being related.
Thank you for this question. I think of my own family's experience. My mother and my aunts grew up in boarding school in South Dakota. And they didn't talk about it. My mother didn't. She would just say, well, we were poor and I'm done with all that. And so, you know, I was a would-be, wannabe writer. So that's all I needed was, oh, here's a mystery. And so, when I became old enough to really come back to her and ask those questions, then that became the focus of the memoir that I wrote, was to go back to my mother and my aunts and ask them to share their stories. And I had them sit together. So then they could share it as a family. And what that does is remove some of the shame that comes through the boarding school experience. And my hope is that nothing is ever lost. This is what an elder told to me, is that it can be displaced, it can be forgotten for a generation or two, but if we are determined to retrieve that information, then we bring it back. And some of it is through this intergenerational communication. But having my mother and my aunts have that opportunity to tell the story of their boarding school days, and then I could do the research to put it in context, because no one in my family knew why they had boarding schools or why they were there. And so we as a family got this story back. We reclaimed it. And I could put it in a book that would then go out with that ripple effect to other people whose families have lost those stories. And then they may be inspired to do their own research, to do the interviews with their family members. Give them that opportunity to tell your story. And that was when I understood how powerful storytelling is. That if you bring those stories back, you change everything. So, and we're not everybody can write a book, but we can all tell stories.
Yes. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you, Miigwech, for coming to the festival at all, for this panel. Thank you to my beloved friends. There's a table where, if you are so inclined, you might go and have signed books for people if you want. Yeah, thank you. Hope you stick around. There's a lot more coming this afternoon. Miigwech.
Miigwech Bizendawiag. Thank you for listening.